Well, welcome back, everybody, to our last session, session 8, as we've termed it, and our final 3 speakers for the colloquium. And I'm thrilled, delighted to be able to introduce Professor Heather Baker from the University of Toronto, who will be presenting for us today on the history and archaeology of in the first millennium BC. So Heather, thank you very much for being here, and you launch your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you see it now?
We are, perfect. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay,
yes,
thank you very much. Okay, sorry about that. This is a new platform for me. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation to speak in this colloquium. I'm sorry I haven't been able to be present so far. It's just the middle of the teaching week. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here now. So I'm going to speak about the history and archaeology of in the first millennium BC. But as I see that Dr. Curtis is going to speak about the Neo-Assyrian period at the end of this session, so I'm going to focus my remarks more on the Neo-Babylonian period and afterwards. So to begin with, just a quick outline. So introduction, which is the outline itself. And then I'll give you a quick potted history of in the first millennium BC. I'll then say a little about the textual sources. And then I'll go on to look at the archaeological, sorry, there's a mistake there, archaeology and topography of and then I'll end up with some very brief conclusions. So my aim is to give you an overview of in the first millennium BC, but especially focusing on the Neo-Babylonian period on. So first of all, the history of in the first millennium. And I just have a couple of timelines here. So at the beginning of the first millennium BC, we don't have very much documentation of in general. There's a dearth of tablets, etc. So we're dealing with a period of relative obscurity. By the middle of the 8th century BC, for the next 60 years or so, we see Babylonian struggles with Assyria, culminating in Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon in 689 BC. And after that, we see Neo-Assyrian governors being appointed in and these are particularly dominated by one family. So Ningal-Idin, who is succeeded by his 3 sons, Sin-Balasu-Ikbi, Sin-Sharu-Utser, and Sin-Tabni-Utser. And I've highlighted the name Sin-Balasu-Ikbi because he's the one who carried out a certain number of building works on the religious precinct in and also he left behind some of his inscriptions. Then we end up in the Babylonian revolt around the middle of the 7th century BC. I should say that the chronology of the terms of office of these governors are not certain. And so Sin-Tabni-Utser probably held office, the last of these 4 members of this family, he probably held office until at least 648 BC. But after that, we don't really know what happened. So we have, again, a bit of a dearth of information about until the reign of Nabopolassar, who takes the throne of Babylon in 626, and after several years' struggle manages to achieve independence from Assyria. So this is a potted history of down to the beginnings of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. And I should note that the archive of Sin-Uballit, that I'll say a little bit about shortly, falls within this period of this struggle between Babylonia and Assyria under Nabopolassar. And then moving on to the Neo-Babylonian era and beyond, I've highlighted the key rulers who carried out significant building works at So first of all, of course, Nebuchadnezzar II, who completely reconstructed the religious precinct. And then also again, Nabonidus rebuilt the religious precinct. And he's also well known for installing his daughter En-Nigaldinana as N2 priestess. And then in the Achaemenid era, we know that Cyrus II carried out a little bit of work on I'm sorry, there's a typo there in the dates for Cyrus. So carried out some work on the religious precinct, and we have a few brick inscriptions of his. And then in the Hellenistic era, the latest tablet from Ur is dated quite early after Alexander's conquest, so 317 BC. So that's the history of Ur in the first millennium BC in a very quick nutshell. And now I want to say a little bit more in detail about the textual sources. I'm going to focus on the Neo-Babylonian archives, Neo and Late Babylonian archives from Ur. So the primary publication is, of course, Figula's 1948 publication of the Neo-Babylonian business documents from Ur. So we're talking of 211 tablets in total. 3 of those are duplicates, and so he decided not to copy the duplicates, and so he produced 208 tablet copies in the book. So in his book, he distinguishes 4 groups that have discrete excavation numbers, and these correspond more or less to 4 discrete archives from housing in the N8 site, which I'll say a little bit more about shortly. And so you see these with the numbers on the bottom of this slide. So the 2 first groups belonging to the archive of Sin Ubalit, the first group found in a jar, and then 17239 found on top of the jar. So these belong together. And then the archive of the Galabu family, and finally the Sin Ili archive. So these are the major groups that Figula distinguished. In a little bit more detail, we have 2 recent studies of Neo-Babylonian archives in general, but from different perspectives. So Pedersen's book of 1998 categorizes the archives for which we have a known find spot. So these include, in his numbering system, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then Michael Ursa in 2005 studied Neo-Babylonian archives in general, but he was also taking into account archives that are reconstructed based on their contents, such as topographical information, etc. So not necessarily with a fixed find spot, but also including other groups which could be reconstructed based on internal criteria. So I've tried to summarize this information here. So in the beginning, the Sin Temple Archive, Pedersen's 2. So these are not identified in publication, as I note in my table, which means that Ursa wasn't able to include them in his catalogue of the various archives. So these were found to the northwest of the ziggurat near the Temenos wall. And these tablets appear to be remnants of an administrative archive. And based on the find spot, they probably date to the Achaemenid period. And then the archive of the Sin Ubalit family. This is Pedersen's 3. And this was found in House 7, Room 15. There are 71 tablets identified here. And these have quite a restricted time range in the late 7th century BC. And these are basically business documents and letters, especially including debts owned by Sin Ubalit himself. Another major archive is that of the Galabu or Barber family of Ur. So this is Pedersen's 4, and this was found in a nearby house, House 6, Room 8. Pedersen numbered 51 tablets in this archive, but a more recent study by Olga Popova has come up with the number 45 tablets. And these, as you see, these have quite a long time range, dating between 576 and 317 BC. And these include property and business documents concerned with land, so real estate in and outside the city, temple prebends, and so on. And then also the Sin Ili family archive, so 5, and these were found next to House 5. These don't have such a, shall we say, such a good find spot. There are 15 of these tablets, and they date between 517 and 482 BC, and these are primarily legal documents concerned, for example, with date orchards and so on. So I'm just going to show you a map. So on the left is Pedersen's map of Ur, showing the find spots of the Neo-Babylonian archives. I'm not speaking about Ur6 because this is a library, although I have shown it on the plan on the right, which shows the find spots of especially the Sin Ubalit archive and the Galabu archive. So houses 6 and house 6 and house 7. So these are the find spots in general. So most of them found in and around the NH area of housing. Now, to go back to this work on categorizing the archives, so Yrsa's study also included a couple more groups that he identified on the basis of their contents, and these are so-called archives for which we don't have a find spot. So in the first case, the so-called archive of Damkir, which is very small, only 3 tablets, and these appear to be dated around the time of the governor Ningal Idin, so around 680 BC, and these are property documents. And then a slightly larger group belonging to Nidinti Ea, and these have been dated in the reign of Artaxerxes I, so between 403 and 380 BC. And this is a business archive which contains no property deeds. Just checking my timing. Yeah, so moving on. We also have archives that have been identified from Hall's excavations, and these were categorized in 2005 in Yrsa's study. So he notes an early Neo-Babylonian archive of 3 tablets, dated around the middle of the 7th century BC, comprising title deeds to property, prebends, slaves, and then the Imbia family, and it's not entirely certain how many tablets should be ascribed to this archive. So these date in the early Achaemenid period, and this group consists of legal and administrative documents, including a reference to a temple prebend. But now recently we have a lot more information about these tablets, these archives from Hall's excavations, because a book has recently been published that provides a complete edition of the tablets from Hall's excavation. So this is by Radoslav Tarasevich, published in 2018. And so he edits 65 tablets and fragments and groups them into 5. So first of all, the early archive, these are the three tablets that were in the previous slide, mentioned already by Yrsa. And then the Imbia archive, to which he assigns 27 tablets. And then also records of an institutional background, so 14. Documents without connection to any archive, 2 of those, and then poorly preserved records. So this is a significant contribution to our knowledge of the archival texts from Ur. And then another insight into the private archives is provided by the summary from a recent study by my colleague Paul-Alain Beaulieu, who listed the archives according to the latest date, so the latest dated tablets. And this, of course, enables us to range them in approximate order of their time of deposition. So just another way of viewing the data. So the Damkir archive, followed by the early archive, Sinubalit, Imbia, Sin Ili, Nidinti Ea, and then Galabu. Okay, so that's a quick insight into the tablets. What I'll be doing later is drawing on the archival text to some extent to integrate the evidence from them with the archaeological evidence as a way of getting a better insight into the historical topography of Ur. But anyway, so I want to now turn to the question of the archaeology and topography. First of all, just a quick note. I said I wouldn't speak much about the period prior to the Neo-Babylonian period, but just a quick view of some of the housing that predates the Neo-Babylonian era. And so this is housing that was originally assigned to the Kassite period, but which Tim Claydon has recently redated in a study in 2014 in the journal Iraq. He's redated this housing, especially to the 8th to 7th centuries BC. And so just one of these areas, the KPS house site on the right, And in the middle of the screen, you see the location of this housing in connection to the religious precinct. And then it's actually overlain by Nebuchadnezzar's temenos wall. So just a quick snapshot of some of what's going on in the earlier part of the first millennium BC. But anyway, so moving on to the Neo-Babylonian period, and of course, most of the results are published in William Mallowan's 1962 volume, Excavations 9, the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods. And I've used the map published by Zettler and Hafford in the RLA on the right to highlight the key areas of Neo-Babylonian features that have been excavated. So number 2, Nebuchadnezzar II's temenos, and then number 7 in red, area NH, this area of Neo-Babylonian housing, and then towards the top, the so-called palace of Baal Shalti-Nannar. So I'll say a little bit more in detail as we go along, but this is just to give you the layout of the site and where the key Neo-Babylonian remains have been located. First, a word about the Neo-Babylonian defences. So the city wall of Ur in the Neo-Babylonian period. This is not actually, these remains are published in an earlier volume, in the Ur III period volume, in which Woolley details the work on the city wall. It's actually quite difficult to trace the Neo-Babylonian remains, but I have tried to highlight in red the traces that are shown on this plan, which is kind of palimpsest. As best I could by scrutinizing the written description in the UE6 volume. And so you can see that they're really quite insubstantial. So the most substantial trace of city wall as we can identify it in the publication stretches around the southeastern part of the city's perimeter. So really quite insubstantial. And this is in line, I think, in a previous publication, I've argued that in Neo-Babylonian times, the defences of the southern Babylonian cities seem to have been somewhat neglected. We see the same thing happening also at Uruk, where the excavators have reported that the city wall was pretty much abandoned, although of course it still survived as an earthen monument at that time. But what we see in terms of rebuilding, maintenance of the city walls is that Neo-Babylonian rulers paid attention to the cities of northern Babylonia, presumably for the defense of the realm. That was what they considered important, whereas the southern cities seem to have been rather neglected in that respect. So kind of fits in with that picture, if that is indeed correct. And moving on to look at the palace of Baal Shalti-Nannar. So this was thought by the excavators to be the palace in which Nabonidus' daughter, the Entu priestess, lived. But it has been suggested since then that it's probably not the case. And I tend to agree with Penelope Redock's argument. And I think it's more likely that it was the governor's residence. And so on analogy with Neo-Assyrian governors, for example, provincial and city governors would have their own kind of palatial-like structure. And this fits in quite nicely with that. So yeah, I think it's more likely the seat of the local governor. In terms of its architecture, it fits, it corresponds quite well with domestic architecture of the time. So in terms of major internal courtyards with a large room, usually on the south or southwest or southeast. So we see that here, for example, and also in the case of this internal courtyard. But then also you have this curious corridor-like arrangement, which is, I would say, somewhat reminiscent of Nebuchadnezzar II's South Palace at Babylon, where you have a complex system of corridors. But it's interesting to note that it doesn't actually provide access to much of the core of the building. So it's only really around the southeastern corner where you have access and along the eastern side. But anyway, so in terms of the actual units within the building, we see quite a lot of parallels with domestic architecture of the day, and also, of course, with palatial architecture. So moving on to look at the houses, several houses identified. The most striking one is House 1 in the top left. And this is one of the biggest Neo-Babylonian houses of the day. So it's comparable to House 3 in the Merkus area of Babylon in size. So roughly just under, say, 1,500 square meters. And again, it has internal courtyards with the same arrangement of a major room. Some people use the term reception room. I don't like that. I think this is basically the living room suite, and also I think that the main living suite of the house would be assigned to the head of the household. But anyway, so yeah, this multi-courtyard arrangement with streets, a major street aligned from northwest to southeast. I'll say a quick word about this shortly. I must pass on for reasons of time, but I just want to highlight also that recent work has, this is work by Emily Hammer, published in Iraq for the year 2019. So her work has identified traces of architecture visible on the surface of the mound, and it's the yellow lines especially that indicate visible surface architecture aligned with the excavated Neo-Babylonian housing that you see at the top center. And so the idea obviously is that this housing spread way beyond the excavated area. And so this is quite intriguing. Some quite well preserved lines, possibly street in this area here. And so this is important work that's expanding our knowledge of Ur's archaeology and topography. Now, to bring in the evidence of the archival texts, we have evidence for toponyms relating to the urban landscape. So, for example, textual evidence shows quite clearly that there was a canal running through the city, and this has been long sort of identified. And the red arrow here shows on, this is, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Shows on, this is another figure, a satellite image published by Hammer in her 2019 publication. So the red arrow shows the likely line of this canal through the city, running from, presumably, the northeast or the east down to the southwest here. And so it seems quite plausible to me that this is identified with what is known in the text as the Ihili Tumur Canal. And actually we have a couple of properties described in a couple of the documents that are in direct proximity to this canal. So I've given you little schematic diagrams. In this case, in the first case, a document written about 576 deals with the property that is bordered by a street on the northwest and the canal on the southeast. And then another property which has the canal on its northwest side. Interestingly, these are named as being in two different city districts. So the first is in the so-called Ihili Tumur Canal district, and the second is in the Sunrise Gate district. And so in the latter case, obviously we should be thinking in terms of a gate that's on the eastern side of the city. And so that, I think, places this Sunrise Gate district somewhere around here, I would imagine. Anyway, moving on. So from the archival text, we have names of a number of city gates in Ur, and in general, it's difficult, of course, to pinpoint these on the ground, although I've already suggested of a general area in which we might locate the Sunrise Gate. It's also worth pointing out that if we look at the traces of Neo-Babylonian architecture, both the excavated traces and the ones that have been identified later, we can actually trace the line of a street here along this wadi. I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but if we trace it to the edge of the mound, we get what is presumably the likely location of a gate, though of course we can't identify the name of the gate that might have existed in this area. So anyway, 5 city gates known by name. There were certainly more, I would say. The Exalted Gate, the King's Gate, the Lugal Ira Gate, the Nippur Facing Gate, and the Sunrise Gate, which I just mentioned a few words about. The nipple facing gate is interesting because actually Nippur actually has an facing gate. So there's a nice correspondence here. So we see on the Kassite city map of Nippur, I've shown this arrow points to the facing gate. And so this is Nippur in the center in relation to and so, yeah, it's positioned nicely to face in the direction of And so I would assume that the Nippur facing gate of is located somewhere along the northwest side. That arrow isn't meant to be pointing to a specific point, but rather that side in general. So anyway, this is another aspect that we can kind of glean from the textual information in relation to Earth's topography. We also know the names of several city districts, and of course some of these are named after gates, the Exalted Gate district. Also we have a district named after the Ihili Tuma Canal. And so given that I located the Sunrise Gate district somewhere in this region on the eastern side of the city, I would assume that the Ihili Tuma Canal district is somewhere perhaps to the southeast of the Temenos, so perhaps in this area. And we don't know how big these districts were, so it may have encompassed NH, but that's not certain. And then other gates, so perhaps other districts, the so-called Kingsgate district, perhaps the reading is slightly uncertain, the Lugal Ira Gate district, the Nippur facing gate district, presumably on the northwest side, and then, as I mentioned already, the Sunrise Gate district. I think it's, yeah, so I'm going to skip to the conclusions now. I think I'm more or less keeping to time, I hope. So just by way of conclusion, first point to make is that first millennium BC is important for the continuity of its archives because they take us right through from the Neo-Babylonian, actually before the very early Neo-Babylonian period, right through to the Achaemenid period and into the early Hellenistic period. And this is important because in general, for the Babylonian cities, we typically have something of a dearth of later Achaemenid documents. And so is unusual in that respect, as Paula Lambolier has pointed out, and that we have a substantial amount of archival material, including from the later Achaemenid period. So we have this nice continuity that we can trace through the archives. Another key point to make is that Hammer's recent fieldwork shows that the site's occupation is much more extensive than previously thought. And also this includes a substantial area of off-mound settlement. And this is important because in general, for the Neo-Babylonian cities, we don't know very much at all about what's going on off the site. So it's quite rare that we get some insight into settlement beyond the city walls. And also this work has rather expanded the overall area of the site's occupation, which is quite important because in the past has been characterized as something of a backwater that was really kept alive by royal sponsorship of the temples. And that may still be a feature to bear in mind. But I would say also that if this substantial off-mound settlement was extensively occupied during the Neo-Babylonian period, then we can maybe think about a slightly different scenario in which at least some of the city's population were not so focused around the temple in the heart of the city. A slight caveat to that is the fact that Hammer puts the second and first millennium together in terms of looking at the spread of occupation beyond the city, beyond the mound itself. So dating is still an issue that remains to be clarified. And then finally, the point that the integration of textual and archaeological data helps to clarify some aspects of the city topography. So I'll leave you with that thought, and then just a quick roundup of bibliography concerning recent studies of in the first millennium BC, so from the last decade or so. So thank you very much. I don't know if I should stop sharing now or what happened. Hi.
Thank you, Heather, very much indeed. That was a wonderfully clear and very comprehensive coverage of a millennium. So Thank you very much. It really, I think you've touched on a recurring theme in many ways of this colloquium, which was the need to think about off the mound as much as on the mound.
Yes.
And also you brought together, of course, that key component of the integration of textual material and archaeology. So it was a great treat. Thank you very much indeed. Let me just check to make sure whether the questions are here. So I have, yes, one question in this. Do you have a sense of the size of the population?
Oh, I should say, well, it's not something I've looked into. I mean, generally, as with all Mesopotamian sites, we face the problem of knowing, pinpointing the extent of occupation. I mean, I already highlighted the fact that the occupied area for the Neo-Babylonian period is not exactly certain, since we have this issue of putting the second and first millennium data together. So until that's clarified, really, it's quite difficult to identify the actual occupied area. And of course, we only have a relatively small area of Neo-Babylonian housing that's been exposed. And without knowing what the rest of the mound is like, it's always quite difficult to make these population estimates. So the short answer is I haven't actually tried to figure this out. I think it would be challenging. But yeah, so these problems are well documented, and maybe it's something for the future. Yeah, I would like to know that myself.
Yes, so an ongoing question. Thank you very much. Something for the future. But for the moment, Heather, thank you so much for your contribution.
Okay,